Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Economy and Society seminar. We're really lucky today to have Alex Wood joining us from Bristol, I think, but a lecturer in the Department of Management in Birmingham Business School. So one of the people from my tribe of kind of refugee sociologists in a business school. So we're very much the children of Thatcher. I'm not sure if Alex signed up to that description, but when the hammer came down on sociology departments, there was a great influx of talent into the business school, which is very much kind of be careful what you wish for scenario for the Thatcheristas. Anyway, so talking today, Alex is going to be presenting a paper he developed in 2019, really interesting paper on the gig economy. It's doing remarkably well. It's got a lot of attention, and this kind of field that's being improvised into life very quickly as we try and make sense of what are these new themes and trends in work. And I think Alex is on to something interesting with this paper. So I won't dwell too long. Alex will give you the blast on it. So I suspect he'll talk for 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever length it really takes to introduce the work. It has been circulated, so I know many of you will have already read it. And we'll have a few questions. So ask questions in the chat, put up your hand, and I'll just welcome Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. It's great to be with you this morning. Hopefully the internet lasts, and it's kind of often ironic because I'm actually going to be talking about remote internet-based work, and so we can imagine some of the struggles that the workers that I'm talking about have and the stresses they face if we have any problems. But hopefully this will be a good gig. I'll share my screen. So, was. There we go. Yeah, so as Ray says, this is an article published in Work, Employment and Society, which I wrote with my colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute as part of a research project, which was funded by the IDRC and the ERC at the Oxford Internet Institute, and was led by Mark Graham. And so my co-authors are Mark Graham, Billy Ledenbeater, and Isis Hajorath. And kind of what this article, what this project was really about was about looking at kind of the development potential of people being able to work remotely through the internet via online platforms, which kind of subsequently became to be understood as part of the gig economy. And so what we wanted to look at was what were the working conditions that people had using these platforms, because lots of the World Bank and Rockefeller Foundation, the UNDP had kind of been talking about the real potential of this technology to enable workers to connect, workers to connect to the global economy via these platforms. Let me just get rid of the chat for now. So I'll just talk for 10, 15 minutes, just giving an overview of the paper and making some connections to kind of my current research as well. And so by the gig economy, what it subsequently became to be understood as, according to the Taylor Review of the UK government's review into modern employment, is people using apps, or probably more correctly platforms, to sell their labor. So it's specifically people selling labor rather than access to assets like things like rooms through Airbnb that we're interested in. So it's particularly labor power being sold through these platforms, which is central to this definition, but also the platform, the technology is central to it, because although kind of the gig economy or gig work might have existed for a long time in terms of contingent work, people working on projects you know, the term obviously comes from the music industry. It's the technology which really enables this to be done on a bigger scale through these platforms, and enables there to be kind of this whole or a sector of the economy based around this contingent project task-based work. And so there's kind of millions of people doing this work in across the world. In Britain, one survey found that 2.8 million people had used a labour platform to make money in the last 12 months, and about half that number are kind of doing it regularly every month. So it's an important thing to study. It's affecting millions of people, but something I'll return to at the end is that this is still a small percentage of the entire workforce, and it's unlikely that everybody's going to end up working in the gig economy. But in the conclusion, I'll talk about why I think the gig economy is important to study beyond just kind of the impact on those people who are working in it. And so when we think about the gig economy, we think it's useful to think about it in terms of what we call the local gig economy and the remote gig economy. And the local gig economy is where the work is being transacted through a platform, but then is being delivered in a locality close to, proximate to the person purchasing it. And so things like Uber, Deliveroo, Foodora, that probably everybody's familiar with, but also delivery work like Amazon, Flex, and handy kind of work and care work, domestic work such as TaskRabbit, Airtasker, and Helpling. And we think it's important to make this distinction because if you're having to deliver the service kind of locally to your client, then there's quite different types of that work is being embedded in quite different ways. Whereas what we're looking at here is the remote gig economy, what we call the remote gig economy. And here happening through the app on your computer or the platform, but also the labour's being delivered virtually via that platform, via the internet. And so it's kind of, disembedded from territories in a way which is kind of different to the local gig economy. And within this remote gig economy, there's more macro, more traditional freelance work, which I'm gonna mainly be talking about. And then there's more micro work, which is much more fragmented and is most well known with Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And it's things like tagging images, tagging, breaking down data, doing data entry on these micro work platforms. But the micro work platforms are probably quite a lot smaller in terms of the number of people doing this work than the macro gig economy. And surveys would suggest that probably this remote gig economy is of a similar size, similar numbers of people are doing it to the local gig economy. And so the types of work that people are doing in this remote gig economy, it's really anything which can be done digitally, the digital manipulation of information via a computer, and then can be transacted via the internet. So it's things like professional services, so accounting, consultancy, project management at the high end, but also at the low end, things like clerical and data entry, so transcription, virtual assistants, web research. There's also creative and multimedia work, so graphic design, doing photography, audio work, but also many people are doing kind of marketing work, so either doing lead generation, search engine optimization, or social media marketing, as well as another high-end type of work being done on these platforms is software development and technology, as well as people doing lots of writing work. And many of the workers that I'm going to be talking about today were doing this writing type of work. So the article is based on kind of face-to-face interviews with 107 Southeast Asian and Sub-Saharan African workers. And again, that's because we had this interest in kind of the claims about development and this work. And what we argue in the paper is that working conditions or job quality can be understood as being shaped by the way that bargaining power and technology combine to create organizational forms, which then are then influenced by particular contextual factors. So particularly we focus on education and gender relations within societies to lead to kind of experiences of job quality. And this framework was quite important for us to show that there was or argue why there was commonalities across different types of tasks. Somebody doing graphic design had similar job quality as somebody doing programming, but also across the two platforms there was also similarities, and also a worker in the Philippines had similar experiences to a worker in Nigeria, but there are also differences as well, which we then sought to explain. We also then, well, after we'd done the interviews, we then wanted to see if the themes that were emerging from the interviews were things which a wider number of workers experienced beyond our interviews. And so we did a survey of 679 workers, and we used the platforms themselves to search for workers which kind of fitted into categories which we thought were of kind of set sizes based on how easy different workers were to find. And the reason we did that is, rather than just posting a project or inviting everybody, is because the platform's algorithms kind of determine which workers will get selected. And so we wanted, kind of having a random sample, probabilistic sample, wouldn't have been possible, even if sometimes people think they are kind of getting a probabilistic survey sample, but they're not by using these platforms. Okay, so just quickly on the main findings, kind of what we found was that for the majority of our interview informants and survey respondents, this was an important source of income, and these platforms provided the main occupation for many of these workers. So it's really important to them and enabled them to make ends meet in many cases. But also, actually quite positively, many workers talked about the autonomy they experienced doing this work, and also that they had a lot of variety in which tasks they were doing, who they were working for, and that meant they could find it quite interesting, because even if they started getting bored with say doing translation for academics, they could then do translation for a journalist, and that then made the work kind of enabled that autonomy, agency, enabled them to have to make the work interesting. And this was kind of a real positive that really was quite clear in the interviews, but also the survey. And we argue that this autonomy, and that which then leads to this variety and it being interesting work, is due to the way that control operates through these platforms, which are based on algorithmic control. And so what the main way, the most kind of everybody stresses, the most important thing is having a high rating on the platform's search tools. And so basically here I've searched for somebody to do data entry. The platform is then suggested pages, there was probably 10 pages of suggestions, and this is just the first page. And obviously if I'm looking to hire somebody for data entry, I'm not going to scroll through all of the pages and pick somebody on page 10, but rather I'm going to pick one of these highly rated people, highly ranked people by the platform's algorithms, who is ranking them based on this job success score, which is a combination of things like the rating they've received from clients for their communication, the rating they've received for the quality of their work, how quickly it was done, combined with how many hours they've done, what their hourly rate is, what skills the platform thinks they have, and it's created this ranking for me. And so everybody stressed the most important thing was getting a good rating. You had to make sure you got a good rating. But actually, so it was a really powerful source of control. but whilst you're doing that work, you have a lot of autonomy. There's not a manager stood over your shoulder telling you how to do the job. You have freedom to decide how to do it, as long as you do it well and your client gives you a good rating. And so we argue in the paper that this isn't kind of, often this is referred to as kind of neo-Taylorist control, but it's not kind of a Taylorist form of control, because that involves the intense monitoring and measurement of the actual labor process that people are doing. Whereas this algorithmic control operates at the end of the labor process, but you have autonomy during the labor process. But this control mechanism, we also argue, also means that you can have a lot of control of labor without having proximity to the workers. And so you don't need this manager stood over the workers. And that enables very high levels of global competition between these workers. And this was something the workers really felt. That was a very competitive environment, and they had to, they were competing with workers all around the world. And this was heightened by them not having any labor protections, being defined by the companies as being freelancers, self-employed, being on-demand labor that could be fired on demand. We also found that for some workers, they had very high kind of incomes, but this was dependent on getting multiple clients, because the competition meant that they couldn't push their wages up, but if they had a strong reputation, they could get. This then meant they had a very high work intensity, particularly because they were so afraid of getting a bad rating. If you didn't please a manager, a client, I mean, you wouldn't get a good rating. And so people were working very hard, working without breaks, working nights, working very long hours to make sure they met their clients' demands. And this also meant that this kind of spatial and temporal flexibility that people often talked about as being a positive was really a myth. People didn't have any option but to work from home, but also if you had to work at night, you had to work when the clients in the West, where most of the clients were based, were online, and you had to follow the demands that they wanted and meet their deadlines. So many workers were working long hours, but also working at night. And I'll just go over this quickly, is that we also found that kind of inequality in terms of income and also security was kind of really central in this type of work, because it was such a competitive environment. If you're doing a more high-skilled task, then you earn significantly more than if you're doing a low-skilled task. But even within just the low-skilled workers, we found massive inequality of a 1 to 19 ratio between the 10th and 90th percentile income. And we argue that that's because of the importance, the symbolic power of reputation. So reputation actually is even more important than skills in this type of work, because of how control operates through this algorithmic control. So we find this kind of polarization in job quality, that in-demand workers have high pay, labor market and income security, and could even afford private health insurance, whereas workers lacking strong platform reputations struggle to survive. And so I'll just move on to the conclusions, because I'm overrunning. That what we find is that there's kind of commonalities despite these diverse national contexts and job types. We also find that workers generally experience autonomy, but also intense, long, and unsocial hours, as well as social isolation from working at home. But there's also a lot of inequality in pay and security, and with in-demand workers having high incomes and labor market security and income security, and low demand workers experiencing kind of low incomes and precarity. And there were some differences in terms of geography and gender, but kind of what I just want to end on is why I think this is really important to research these forms of control, because what I've been looking at now in my current research and starting to look at is how this algorithmic management is spreading to conventional sectors, particularly with Amazon's warehouses and other warehouses, And so this video is somebody wearing goggles, glasses, which then are directing them around the warehouse. And we see already with places like Amazon, wearable devices whereby workers have to meet a pick rate. And if they're not, then they'll be algorithmically flagged up for discipline by their employer. So I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so what a wonderful paper. And so many places to go with it. So you left so many threads there from, you know, this idea that it is the gig economy has captured our attention in a way that is outsized to the portion of it, but then the sense that it's, you know, it's presaging the future of work in more ordinary work environments. And a really interesting context as well for the paper in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Job quality and this idea of it not being tailorist, but yet being kind of the term algorithmic control and that. So lots of places to go, and we have a few questions in the chat, so we might start there first. So I think if you want to put up your hands or if you want to ask in the chat, feel free. So we've Patrick Gallagher and we've Janos there as well. So Pat, if you want to turn on your mic, if the internet allows that kind of thing.
Yeah, hi, Ray. Sorry, I might leave my video off because I've really rural Wi-Fi today. Hopefully, if you get me by next September, I'll have better Wi-Fi. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about power within your paper, because you kind of conceptualize it in a novel way, how the platform pitches workers against each other.
Yeah, so something that we really took inspiration from Arnie Kalleberg's work on job quality was that he doesn't go into it in that much detail, but he mentions in his book, Good Jobs, Bad Jobs, which hence where we also took the title from our paper from, that not only, particularly in these, as we've moved to these individualized, highly market mediated forms of employment systems, no longer is it just kind of power relations existing between labor as a group and an employer or capital, but rather it's also workers in these individualized market mediated employment systems are competing against each other. And I think unfortunately, even in kind of academia, we can see this, that it's become much more individualized. People increase their wages by applying for jobs elsewhere, by then demanding higher wages, and you have this individualized bargaining taking place. And so this idea that we needed to not only understand the power difference between kind of the platform and workers, and also clients and the workers, but also in between workers as well, was kind of central to explaining this heterogeneity that we found. And I think when we first started writing the paper, a lot of our thinking was kind of how can we deal with this heterogeneity and like tell a story? Is there kind of a story? And then we realized that central to that story is the inequality and the individual power between different workers, and then this importance of reputation. We were thinking about power in terms of bargaining power in traditional senses, and then we realized that actually the symbolic power of your reputation in the gig economy is central. And so I think those are two things which are kind of central to the way the future of work's being shaped by technologies, is this increased individualization and competition, but also the increasing importance of symbolic power as well as traditional kind of bargaining power around skills, or collective bargaining power.
Well, that's really fascinating. Just as I'm listening to you, though, I'm thinking of Burroway's manufacturing consent and the idea of like workplace games, you know, and I wonder, I know they used to play games against the machine, and there was a kind of a, you know, how many bits could you turn out in an hour or whatever. Well, it's different. There was a symbolic power in that, you know, workers were, their power came from, you know, how quick they were. And I'm just thinking about the, you know, how important the scores are on the internet. It's interesting. So much has changed, and yet the same things are happening in work, of pitching workers against each other.
Yeah, definitely. And if I, just quickly on that, also I have a bit of self-promotion. I also have a book that came out last year based on my PhD, which is using a Borroway framework, but looking at retail. And there I was expecting to find work games, but what I didn't really find any evidence of work games in terms of creating consent, because Borroway talks about how kind of, if you, outside of hegemonic regimes, these work games just become spiraling spirals of work intensification, because there's no kind of workers can't create a base upon which consent can be created. And I think that's often the gig economy. There's a lot of gamification and gig economy platforms using games to exploit people, but workers don't have the bargaining power to actually use those games in a way which kind of increases their kind of material rewards and produces kind of consent.
Well, it's fascinating. I wonder, could you stick a link to the book or whatever, or I'll email the individual. Thanks a lot. That's great. Thank you.
No, thanks, Pat. So next we've Janos, then we've Antoinette, Tina, and Kieran in that order. So.
Yes, hello, good morning. Thank you for this talk. It's very fascinating, and I actually have a whole lot of questions, and because it's really interesting, this whole theme, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible, because, well, my interest is also in criminology, and what I notice is very interesting in this whole gig economy, and I wonder if you have noticed any of this. Is this idea of accepting the surveillance of for example, of your employer. So I was reading a few interviews in a similar book to yours, and about the whole gig economy, and it was talking about the fact that a lot of people who were interviewed, and I wonder if you have encountered this, was, for example, working for Deliveroo and whatnot. When asked, are you okay with this thing that, you know, employers actually know wherever you are, and all these things that, and they were like, well, to be honest, that's actually, you know, we're fine with that, because what they felt was amazing about their job, that they could meet and, pardon my French, but talk shit about their employees as much as they wanted, and that's kind of something that I noticed that's actually quite amazing, that we have some sort of, when we work and when we're talking at work, we have to have some kind of pose ourselves somehow. But they didn't have this sensation, didn't have this feeling. They were like, they felt terribly free about what they were doing, while at the same time being perfectly controlled, which was quite amazing. It is a sort of paradox, I would call it, and yeah, let's leave it to that. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that we really wanted to try and get across in the paper, was this sense that people felt, we could see that people were very powerfully being controlled. They were working, you know, really intensely, experiencing pain as a result of it. Were really worried about not getting a good rating and then being ranked down by the platform's algorithm. But in doing that work, they also felt this autonomy, and kind of, I think some people, I'm not sure which book it is that you're reading, but often people talk about this as an electronic panopticon, and as a digital sweatshop, or neo-Taylorism. And we found that really wasn't how people were experiencing it. And it raises an interesting question or problem then, if people are being very tightly controlled, powerfully controlled, and that's then even kind of damaging their well-being in terms of their work intensity, but then they don't feel that they are. And I think this is true in other areas of the gig economy as well, where often with Uber, for example, even in Uber, where the control is much more direct, still you're given a customer to pick up, you're given a route to follow. The workers still feel a lot of autonomy often, because they don't have a manager there directly telling them what to do, and they can make some decisions about if there's traffic to take a different route. And so, I think the dichotomy between autonomy and control is often misunderstood, and it's not really a dichotomy. You can have autonomy and also be highly controlled. And again, academia, we can also see that. I think that academics often work very long hours and work very hard, but also kind of probably feel that they experience a lot of autonomy and are choosing to do that work. And so the control is kind of quite effective in that way.
If I may, have you heard about this? In China, I read about in an article about this Chinese delivery service where they started this Smile project. Have you heard about this?
No.
That they would request randomly all their people working for them to stop and make a selfie and see if how presentable they are. So while they're driving, while they're going around, they receive a message. You have to, in 5 minutes, because you might have missed it because you're working, in 5 minutes you have to send a message, a selfie, showing them your how dressed you are, and especially if you're wearing the mask properly. This was integrated for the coronavirus, so they want to be certain that you're constantly wearing the mask and everything. So just quite interesting the way where this can lead. It's how you can feel perfectly free, but at the same time perfectly controlled. It's quite interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And also, this is often implemented for health and safety, and Amazon, in some of their delivery, or their kind of contractors, but Amazon owns the vans. They've installed video cameras which kind of see if somebody's yawning, if they're looking like they're not concentrated, and then tell the worker to take a break, for example, as well as monitoring their acceleration, how close they are to other vehicles. But what we found in this area as well was that workers felt like the surveillance the surveillance that did exist was positive, because it ensured that they got paid, and that they felt that they could kind of game the surveillance that existed of their monitoring of their screens and their keyboard presses. And so that's kind of also another thing, is how I think, which is sometimes missed, is people's sense of agency over these technologies and how they can use them for their own ends.
Yeah. So like
thank you,
oh, thanks, Jonathan. They express their power, like workers express their power by selecting not to take work, like of resisting it. Do they talk much about that calculation?
So in our kind of more recent research, which we're publishing at the moment, we look kind of more in depth into kind of resistance and collective organization, and we have some survey research on it as well. And they're quite high numbers of workers they often, if they're in demand, have a strong reputation, then they might threaten to end a contract with clients and threaten to stop working with them. And we in this article that's coming out in Socioeconomic Review very soon, I've checked the proofs, we call it a subordinated agency that exists, that the workers subordinated to the rules of the platform and the decisions the platforms make and this reputation system, but also they experience agency with relation to their clients, because the platform increases their ability to match with clients outside of their local labor market. And so if they get a strong reputation, then they have this kind of bargaining power with clients. And that also then leads people to feel like they're a business and that they're entrepreneurs, whilst also at the same time feeling like they're workers and they need a trade union and organization because of the platform, the power that the platform has over them.
Thanks, Amal. Antoinette, I think, is next.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting talk, and I enjoyed your paper. I suppose this morning I could speak as an Airbnb co-host. I helped two ladies rent rooms in their house, and up until last year I was getting all the notifications like, what do we do with this bad review? How do we fix it? So it's very interesting. I suppose there's a debate for another day on how all these platforms dealt with the pandemic, where I suppose with my experience of Airbnb, they completely 100% sided with the clients, and the workers were sort of forgotten about in the whole the fallout of that. That's for another day. Something that struck me in your article was that the average person in your survey spent 16 hours a week looking for work on the platform, 39% of their total time. So I just wonder, if that's the baseline, where do we go in terms of job quality with those type of figures?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a problem in the local gig economy as well. And so the UK Supreme Court and the Employment Tribunal before them, what was particularly interesting in their ruling with Uber drivers being workers was that the judges ruled that you were working whenever you had the app turned on, because the app, the company, for it to function, it needed drivers sat idly waiting for work. And so I think this is a problem across the gig economy. I think it's a tricky issue, but I think there has to be a move away from just looking at kind of living wages and people's hourly wages to also looking at living hours. And I think it's really positive that recently, I think last week, it was that the Living Wage Foundation kind of came out with a report on working hours and precarious working hours, and said that I've started a campaign for living hours as well. And so we need to look at, if people are only being paid for the hours they're being productive for the platform, then we need to make sure that they're getting enough hours that their hourly wage is going to be enough. But yeah, it's kind of something which workers said, quite shocking, really, the amount of time that they either spent not only looking for clients, but also having to provide their own training, having to learn how to do things, having to go on forums. And so all of these costs are really being kind of outsourced to the individual worker. And this kind of, we have another article in Sociology which looks at kind of the commodification of this work, and really how it's the shifting of these costs of social reproduction of the labor onto individual workers is a form of, or linked to, the commodification of this work. So yeah, I definitely agree. It's a really difficult, big issue in the gig economy, is working hours, and trying to figure out a way to solve that problem is also a tricky question. I don't know if you have any suggestions.
I don't know. I like that idea where if the app was on and the driver was waiting, that counted. I mean, that's a start, I suppose. But in terms of Airbnb, you've got all the preparation and all of that, and updating your profile. I suppose that's the same in platforms you were talking about. You have to keep your profile up and all the responses up. But I don't know. That's a tricky one. I will look up what you said, your other paper in sociology and the living wage. I'll look further into that.
Cool. Yeah. And it's also, obviously, there's also a gender dimension to it as well, which we talk about in that paper, that then it's often people are doing this remote work whilst they're providing kind of childcare for their children as well. And so it's a way in which, again, the social reproduction really plays a big role in these dynamics.
Great, thanks very much.
Well, thanks. And like behavioral economists are starting to theorize those problems as sludge, late to the party as ever. With this one, but so sorry, Tina is next.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. You alluded briefly in your talk earlier on to academic contexts, and you've returned to it. So part of the thoughts I wanted to share and the question may have been addressed, but I was thinking about the future. You know, how far are these trends likely to continue to the future, and what kind of shapes they will take and what mechanisms are used? And I was thinking about the university context because that's where I work, and the massive expansion of managerialism over the past 10 years or so. And thinking about that, you know, people have talked about us becoming very managerialized and talking about whether that's an embedded thing and we will always be outweighed by managers. And I was thinking, could this possibly be thought of in terms of an intermediate stage for the sort of propagation and evolution of the gig economy? And I was thinking, is this huge expansion in management about transiting and embedding change rather than a long-term development? And I've sort of watched the explosion of procedural datafication, performance datafication, workload management, blah, blah, blah. And sort of wondered in my mind, are universities evolving into platforms? You know, will eventually, once these changes have been embedded, will large sections of the huge number of managers eventually be replaced by algorithms? And will academics eventually become gig workers as part of the growing tendency signaled by short-term contracts, but also the tendency of universities to increasingly outsource, which is a model that, you know, is being reflected across the broader economy. So it was a sort of a question and a set of reflections about, you know, do you think that this is a trend that is likely to evolve and expand, sorry, not continue?
Yeah, I think you're right that I think these two things kind of converge in that it's the increasing availability of data and kind of computer processing power and software to analyze that data has kind of, I think, transformed management and how management is done. So there's much more, even in academia. I remember seeing on Twitter, I can't remember where, but a university was going to make redundancies, and they said one of the things they were going to include were people's Google citations. So using that data from Google Scholar. And I can see that kind of becoming a bigger and bigger thing, is that these managers in universities making decisions on metrics from the internet, as well as student survey questionnaire evaluations. When I was teaching the gig economy, I had to do these module evaluation forms. I said, now's your chance to rate me as if I'm a gig economy worker. And in Birmingham, they give us a mark out of 5 on these different areas. And then we get told you know, we've got a 4.5 rating, and the average in the university was whatever. And so there's this transformation in terms of managerial practice, but also, or the potentials of managerialism, but also what we see in the algorithmic management, particularly in places like Amazon, is also that the role of managers is being restricted to basically the devices the workers are wearing when they're picking these products off the shelves, then are reporting to them, flagging the worker up, saying this worker is below the average productivity. They give them a warning, and then the manager's role is just to provide that warning, to tell them to hurry up, and then to fire them if they don't hurry up. And so really the role of managers is becoming restricted to just carrying out kind of what the algorithms are telling them to do. And so you can see that there's a potential there for the automation of management. At the moment in the UK and the EU, kind of it's illegal to make automated decisions which have significant impacts on an individual. So even with Uber recently, there's kind of been two different court rulings, but Uber will argue that workers aren't automatically deactivated from the platform if they get low ratings, that a human is reviewing that. And then the argument is whether that is kind of a meaningful input from the manager. But there's the potential for kind of the automation of management. But I think probably because it's embedded in kind of institutions and norms, what we'll see is more just the transformation of management to being much less based on managerial kind of intuition and personal relations, to much more just carrying out kind of what the algorithmic systems are telling them is the optimal solution for their workplace.
I guess, you know, from what you said, there's a question of transparency. I mean, you know, it's an issue which is reverberating across politics, institutional management, etc. at the time. So, you know, there's a question of how do we know if we're being managed by algorithm, and you know, if the role of managers shifts to one of discipline and punish, then that is quite an unnerving scenario for the future, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It reminds me of a little paper that Deleuze wrote on controlled societies, and that's quite a spooky future.
Yeah, definitely.
I know there's a strong dystopian vibe to all of this. Okay, no, thank you. So Kieran, and then we have Tom.
Oh, you're on mute, Kieran. You're still on mute.
Hi.
There you go.
Sorry, there we go. Alex, thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. Alex, I'll just be very brief. I just want, if you have any reflections, let's say, on not so much the gig economy, but the gig polity, or perhaps where they kind of interface, I guess, right? Because one of the things that was kind of intriguing was all around the Cambridge Analytica scandal, of course, was the role of the Amazon sub-company called Mechanical Turk, which was exactly this kind of gig machine, employing people on doing tiny, tiny piecework. But of course, it had that enormous consequence and enormous power that, you know, brought you guys Brexit. Sadly, it was that and nothing else. It's not about Russian bots or whatever. It's about gig workers and the gig economy parlayed into the gig polity. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think in a way it relates to the last question or point around kind of transparency, and because often we think of this as AI as being AI, but kind of Amazon Mechanical Turk, it's kind of the humans behind the artificial intelligence, and it's the kind of oil that's making many of these systems work and providing the input data into them, as well as the data kind of sorting, as well as the tagging of data. It's very hard for computers to do still, and so humans are playing that big role. And Mary Gray has a really great book called Ghost Work, all about this work that's being taken place through these platforms, these gig economy platforms. It's highly fragmented, poor work quality, but is kind of necessary to keep the whole internet system working, and also for negative effects such as kind of political manipulation. In terms of our research, we didn't interview anybody doing that kind of work, but we did interview people whose jobs were doing search engine optimization. And so what they were doing, I think Google's changed a bit since then, because these interviews were in 2016. But basically, lots of search engine optimization used to be based around writing web pages that no human was ever going to see, but could then be linked to your customer's web page, so that Google would then think, the Google algorithm would read the web page, think it was written by a human, because it was, and then rank the customer's website higher. And lots of workers were doing this work, as well as writing kind of fake reviews for books. And somebody was working for a travel company, writing reviews of holidays, and I think they were in the Philippines, had never been to any of these places, but were just Googling the local area and then writing a review. But what was interesting was that people actually found this very interesting work to do, and didn't mind the fact that no human was ever going to read their article, because they wanted to be a writer, and they still interestingly identified with it being a writer and enjoyed it. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but you just provoked some thoughts, some memories in me of the people we interviewed doing this kind of ghost work, hidden work that people end up doing behind the scenes to make what seem like technical systems, purely technical systems, actually operate.
It really reminds me your description of that work. Tom Ingold, who presented a number of years ago here, talking about how much fun people find factory work. Be very careful with that idea of patronizing other people's labor, when you haven't kind of talked to them about it and encountered how they experience it themselves. So we have Tom next, Janos for another question, and we'll finish with Millie's point. And maybe just to mention that this Thursday at 10, we have Angus Bancroft, who will be talking about illicit drug markets. Okay, so Tom, if you're there.
Yeah, how are you doing, guys? Thanks for the paper, Alex, and very interesting stuff. I suppose returning to this kind of, and it's almost on Millie's point as well. This thing of the panopticon and all of that. What I got the impression from your work, I suppose, is this. Okay, there are places where there's detailed control and surveillance and monitoring, but largely it's not a dystopian Orwellian vision of gig work, but something more like a Wild West of bounty hunters. I mean, they don't have guns or shoot anybody, but everybody's a hired gun looking to charge the lowest price and scoop up the work as quickly as possible. Everybody's chasing the work. So I don't know, is there another dystopia for that or something? It's not the world of tight control, it's the world of intensified market forces, so that everybody's constantly competing with each other. Is that more what's going on? And also, and if so, in what ways does that reshape the subjectivity of the workers, so that we're not anymore, I don't know, we're not docile drones anymore, but we're all bounty hunters now in the gig economy, like we are as academics, bounty hunters for writing a paper, getting a thing, getting the funding, getting it done. So yeah, kind of different dystopias for you to consider.
Yeah, great question. I think, something that I was really keen to try and get across is that I definitely felt we'd be misrepresenting the workers if we presented it as a dystopia, because they were pleased to be doing this work. They preferred doing it. So in the Philippines, many of these workers were working in BPOs before they were using these platforms. In kind of the sub-Saharan Africa, often they were working in kind of very precarious jobs in the local labor market. So it definitely wasn't, we wanted to get across the positives and the negatives. And definitely the kind of the most powerful kind of trend in it is this hyper competitiveness and the pressure on wages that creates. But I think the dystopian part of it is more this role of then kind of your reputation, that if you had a strong reputation, you could then start charging higher rates if you had a very strong reputation. At least later research that I've been doing is with the UK and US workers, and they are earning higher rates. And so then this reputation and this is what we're writing about at the moment, then becomes a source of insecurity, because a customer can just come along and give you one bad rating, and the algorithm ranks you right down, and you don't get any future work. And so there's this, I think the dystopian part of it is having these platforms which have huge power over people's ability to make a living, and workers don't have any voice. They're not even called workers, they're called customers. Then their only way of contacting the platform is through customer service, even when they might be treated unfairly by a platform. And this then, yeah, in this article in Socioeconomic Review, that should be out soon, what we're trying to do, I'll put it in the chat as well, the preprints, is look at the identity, how this creates an entrepreneurial identity, that you've got to be a business, you've got to see yourself as a business to compete with other workers, and to how you're dealing with clients, but also this feeling of outrage and subordination to the platform, which can just change their rating system, can deny, can say, refuse to remove bad ratings, can change their fees that they charge workers. And I think that's the problem, is, yeah, really the lack of kind of voice that workers have towards the platforms, and the lack of regulation of those platforms.
Okay, no, thanks. So we've two more questions, and we'll call it at that. So we're just at 11 o'clock. So if people need to go and filter off, that's fine. We hope to see some of you on Thursday. And so we might just take Millie's question and then go back to Janos for one more question. So Millie is in Cornwall with dodgy Wi-Fi. So she asked you to maybe make some more further comments about the digital panopticon. You said this isn't really how people experience it, that kind of Taylor-esque
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, so I guess the kind of digital panopticon, I guess you could see it more in, I mean, it does exist in terms of the surveillance is there, but in terms of it having kind of the Bentham or Foucault effect, the Bentham effect, where people feel like they're constantly under surveillance, it's not what people were saying. They felt like they could kind of distort or avoid the surveillance and use it to kind of ensure that clients paid them, and that they felt like they had a lot of freedom when they were doing the work. And I think that's also true in the local gig economy as well, because you don't have the fact it's not a human who's looking over your shoulder. People feel like they're not under surveillance, and therefore you don't have the Foucault type effect where people are internalizing this surveillance and feeling like, and self-policing themselves, because they feel like they're constantly not only are they self-policing themselves, but they then start internalizing that self-policing and having this belief. So I think surveillance is really important, and surveillance is really important to look at in work. But I think that often people overstate this kind of Foucauldian kind of effects of surveillance, which when you actually research kind of workers, they actually experience kind of agency and power, and are engaged in resistance. And I think even Foucault himself, in his kind of end before he died, kind of talked about how he was really talking about the ideal type of power, and how kind of a panopticon might operate in kind of an ideal situation rather than actually existing examples of power.
Thanks. No, that I think clears it. And Janos for the final question.
Yes, thank you again. No, exactly about this point. I'll just add my question of before that I left out, but I think it's still worthwhile. That the interesting thing about this whole thing is especially, well, in Italy, there's a lot of people working, for example, delivering food, and a lot of them are immigrants, and as everywhere, but the interesting thing that you could read a number of articles saying that this was the moment where a lot of these people could actually try to finally do a job that is more, how you could say, with more dignity, instead of, in Italy there's a lot of these things of people going around selling lighters and whatnot, but with this they could start actually doing a more dignifying job and whatnot. And what really came out at the end of this whole thing was that actually it was only a further abuse, meaning that they were, yes, working obviously with delivery and whatnot, but in reality they were using other people's credit cards. So they fundamentally were working, filling up somebody's credit card, and then getting paid €1, €2 per hour, who knows how much. So it's just, the abuse just went on, and actually even became even more uncontrollable, because you have a person coming from whatever in Africa selling ledgers. It's quite easy to understand that he's doing something legal and he's being abused somehow. And obviously there's a whole system of mafia and whatnot about this is wrong and this should be stopped, because he's being somehow he's fundamentally a slave. But then you have the same people going around with delivery bags, and looks fine, suddenly looks fine, but then it's not fine, and it's really not clear. So it's very interesting how the whole abuse simply shift. And I saw your book is actually talking about despotism. So it changed name, it changed figure, it looks fancier because you have a fancy bag now and a fancy logo, but actually it's the exact same sort of black labor, black market, not no retribution, no safety whatsoever, no insurance. Maybe there is somebody who's getting insurance on this, but definitely not the guy on the bike. That's the whole point. So I wonder if you met also this. I'm talking about Italy now. I wonder if you've met something similar.
And maybe just to add in the border crossing element of the way these tasks are distributed from the West across, even when it's remote.
Oh, and just a parenthesis, I'm sorry. All the drug leaders in Italy during lockdown were all going around with delivery bags. This is a simple fact. So they could go around at any time where everybody was locked home, and they were bringing drugs around all of Florence or Italy, because you could just ring a doorbell and deliver drugs. And this is a fact. Not many articles about it, which is quite interesting, but it's quite a fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. Order a pizza to get your drugs. Yeah, so I guess the difference with the remote gig economy, as Ray says, is that Guy Standing refers to it as kind of the first time in history that you have kind of labor migration without kind of human migration, and you can hire a worker anywhere in the world to do this work without having to bring the worker to your premises to do it. But still, the similarity is still that fake accounts and using other people's accounts is really common, and probably there's even a market for buying kind of other people's accounts who've built up all of this strong reputation, and then you can buy their account. And and which is kind of similar, I imagine, in the local gig economy. People are doing it to get around the fact that they don't have the right to work in a country, or the right insurance or whatever. About the platforms, try and clamp down on it. But then again, it's this kind of added insecurity that in the UK, with Uber, there's been many cases of people being deactivated because they've had to take a photo of themselves to prove it's them. The algorithm doesn't match it with the one on file, and then they're deactivated and can't make a living. And again, there's no kind of proper communication channels. The Uber just says until very recently, just said it's a technology company. It's not an employer. It has no responsibilities to these people using their platform who are its customers. And so, I think it really comes down to this issue of platforms not being held responsible enough for their employment or their engagement of these workers, and the working conditions that people experience, and also any exploitation that's taking place of workers through their platforms.
Fantastic, and a great kind of dystopian note to end on. So thank you very much, Alex, for a really great paper and really, really interesting discussion. Thanks to everybody for their questions. I look forward to see people on Thursday. So have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for having me.